Dad doesn't know what day it is half the time now, Nora. You'd see that too, if you visited as often as you claim to care. My uncle said that across a conference table in a law office that smelled like fresh carpet glue, sliding a guardianship petition toward the center of the table like it was a menu he'd already ordered from. My grandfather sat 2 chairs down from him, hands folded, watching his own son describe him as though he weren't in the room to hear it. I'd visited my grandfather 11 times in the 6 weeks before that meeting. I have the mileage on my car to prove it, and I would end up needing to prove exactly that, in exactly that kind of specific, boring detail, before this was over. I want you to remember the way my grandfather sat through that meeting. Quiet, folded hands, nodding faintly at things that weren't quite true about him. Because 4 months later, in a courtroom 2 floors above the one where he used to preside for 34 years, that same quiet, folded hands old man would stand up in the middle of his own competency hearing, look directly at the judge who now sat in his old chair, and calmly dismantle a guardianship scheme his own son had spent nearly a year building on the assumption that a folder full of confused mornings would be enough to take everything that was his. My name is Nora Ashford. I'm 32 years old, and I'm an occupational therapist, which means I spend my working life telling the difference between a person who genuinely can't do something anymore and a person who's decided, for reasons of their own, not to. If you've ever had a family member's decline used as a convenient excuse by someone who stood to benefit from it, stay with me to the end, because my grandfather didn't wait to be a victim of that. He built the whole test himself, on purpose, months before anyone else understood what was actually happening in that house on Birchwood Lane. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. And if you're the kind of person who stays until a story's finished, subscribe now, because what my grandfather orchestrated took the better part of a year to play out, and it's going to take me the next hour and change to tell you exactly how he did ITTO understand what happened in that courtroom. You need to understand a man who spent 34 years deciding whether other people were telling the truth for a living. A lakefront property that's been in my family since 1958, and a son who spent most of his adult life assuming his father's patience for careful process was simply weakness he hadn't gotten around to exploiting yet. Renfield sits on the northern shore of Lake Wren, about 90 minutes from the state capital, the kind of town where the courthouse is still the tallest building on Main Street and half the county remembers exactly which judge presided over their parents' divorce, their neighbor's DUI, or their cousin's contested will. My grandfather, Leonard Ashford, sat on the Larkin County Circuit Court bench for 34 years, from 1987 until his retirement in 2021, and in that time he developed a reputation, among lawyers who both loved and dreaded appearing in front of him, for being nearly impossible to rush and nearly impossible to fool. He asked the same question 3 different ways if he thought the first answer had been rehearsed. He let silences sit until people filled them with the truth instead of the version they'd walked in planning to say. People in Renfield still tell stories about him at the diner on Main Street, the kind of small-town legend that accumulates around a person who held the same public role for over 3 decades. There's the one about the contractor who tried to settle a dispute with a case of good bourbon left on the judge's porch the night before a ruling, and got a public reprimand read into the record the very next morning instead of the leniency he'd been counting on. There's the one about the teenager caught joyriding in his father's truck, who my grandfather sentenced to 80 hours of community service at the very garage where the truck had been repaired twice that year, on the theory that understanding exactly what a thing costs to fix teaches a lesson no fine ever could. People either respected him enormously or resented him quietly, and in a town the size of Renfield, there was rarely much room for anything in between. He retired in 2021, not because his mind had started slowing in any way, but because Eleanor had been gone 2 years by then, and he told the County Bar Association, at his own retirement dinner, that 34 years was enough time to give any single institution and that he intended to spend whatever years he had left doing considerably less arguing and considerably more fishing. Nobody in that room laughed harder at that line than the lawyers who'd spent decades on the losing end of his rulings. My grandmother, Eleanor, was a schoolteacher for most of her life and, by every account I ever heard, the only person who could get my grandfather to stop working a case in his head at the dinner table. She passed in the spring of 2019, 6 years before any of this happened, and something in my grandfather went quieter after that. Not confused, never confused, just quieter, the particular quiet of a man who'd spent his whole life being listened to by a courtroom and now came home to an empty kitchen every evening. He had 2 children. My mother, Carol, and my uncle, Gary. My mother married my father young, divorced him when I was 10, and spent most of my childhood working 2 jobs and, I think, quietly deciding that keeping the peace with her older brother was easier than ever disagreeing with him about anything. My uncle Gary took over Ashford Motors, the Ford dealership my great-grandfather started in 1961, and ran it for close to 3 decades with the specific, restless confidence of a man who genuinely believed that if you talked fast enough and smiled wide enough, the numbers would eventually agree with you. They didn't. Not for the last several years. I didn't know the full extent of it until much later, but Ashford Motors had been bleeding money since a regional Ford allocation shakeup in 2022 left the lot chronically understocked, and Gary had spent the better part of 3 years covering the gap with a series of increasingly aggressive loans against inventory that wasn't moving fast enough to service them. I want to be clear, I never hated my uncle growing up. He was loud and larger than life at every holiday. The kind of uncle who slipped you $20 and told you not to tell your mother. This isn't his villain origin story, not entirely. But you need to understand the shape of this family, and the shape of the debt underneath it, before I show you what my grandfather built to protect himself from both. I was born in 1993. My cousin Derek, Gary's only son, came 2 years later. Growing up, Derek got the easier version of most things: the newer car at 16, the internship at the dealership his father arranged with a phone call, the general assumption that whatever he eventually did with his life would work out because it always had. I got the version where nobody assumed anything would work out for me, which is its own kind of freedom, in hindsight, because it meant nobody was managing my choices closely enough to notice when I made the one that actually mattered. I studied occupational therapy at the State University, did my clinical rotations in a stroke rehabilitation unit, and have spent the last 7 years at Larkin County Rehabilitation and Wellness, most of that time specializing in cognitive rehab for patients recovering from strokes, brain injuries, and early-stage dementia. It is not, by any measure my uncle would recognize, a glamorous job. I make $68,000 a year. I drive a 2015 Subaru with 200,000 miles on it and a check engine light I've made peace with. What the job actually gave me, though, more than any paycheck, was 7 years of sitting across from people whose minds work differently now than they used to, learning to read the very specific, very consistent texture of what real cognitive decline actually looks like, day after day, patient after patient. Which is, I would come to understand, the only reason I was equipped to notice when my own grandfather started performing a version of it that didn't quite hold together. My grandmother Eleanor had been the one who first suggested, half-jokingly, that I might make a good therapist, years before I'd even settled on a major. She'd taught 4th grade in Renfield for 31 years, and she used to say that teaching and therapy were really the same skill wearing different clothes. You watch a person closely enough, long enough, that you start to notice the exact moment something shifts, before they've found the words to tell you about it themselves. She was the one who noticed, months before any doctor did, that my grandfather's own mother had started repeating stories in a pattern that wasn't just old age charm but something slower and more permanent underneath it. My grandfather never forgot that it was Eleanor who caught it first, not him, not any of his law clerks, not any of the physicians who saw her socially for years without concern. I think some part of what he built, all these years later, came from remembering exactly how much attentiveness matters, and exactly how rarely people actually offer it to someone they've already decided has nothing new to tell them. My grandfather and I had always been close, in the particular quiet way that doesn't produce many stories. Sunday dinners, him asking careful, specific questions about my patients that showed he was actually listening, me asking him about old cases and watching him decide, every single time, how much he was allowed to tell me. He never talked about verdicts. He talked, instead, about the shape of how people lied, the small tells, the rehearsed cadences, the way a true account usually wobbles slightly in the retelling while a false one stays suspiciously identical every time. I didn't understand, growing up, that he was teaching me something. I thought we were just talking. After my grandmother died, I started coming by Birchwood Lane most Thursday evenings, not because anyone assigned me to, but because I noticed nobody else was, and because I'd learned, professionally, that a person living alone benefits enormously from somebody checking in on a rhythm regular enough to actually notice when something changes. Those Thursdays became a kind of anchor for both of us, I think, him teaching me how to properly clean a trout he'd caught that morning, me half listening to him rehash some case from 1996 I'd already heard 3 times, both of us quietly grateful for a version of Thursday that didn't require either of us to say out loud how much we missed her. I had no idea, that first year after Grandma Eleanor passed, how much that habit was about to matter. The first thing that actually happened, the real, factual starting point of all of this, wasn't my grandfather forgetting anything. It was Gary finding out, in the fall 2 years ago, exactly how much Ashford Ridge was worth. Ashford Ridge is a lodge on 11 acres of lakefront my great-grandfather bought in 1958, back when land on Lake Wren went for almost nothing. My grandfather inherited it outright when his own father passed in the 90s, and it had sat mostly unused for the last decade except for a handful of family gatherings every summer. The place I learned to fish, the place my grandmother taught me to can tomatoes on the wide-screened porch. Nobody in the family had thought about it as an asset in any serious way. It was just Ashford Ridge. It had always just been there. That changed in October, when a development company called Meridian Shoreline Group started quietly buying up lake-adjacent parcels for a planned condominium project, and a realtor working for them left a card in my grandfather's mailbox with a number written on the back that made my grandfather, by his own account later, sit down at his kitchen table for a long time before he did anything else that afternoon. $2.3 million. That was Meridian's opening offer for Ashford Ridge, contingent on a straightforward, uncomplicated sale. I don't know exactly how Gary found out about that number. What I do know, because Colleen Marsh would later lay it out for me in careful, documented detail, is that within 6 weeks of that offer landing in my grandfather's mailbox, Gary had met twice with a real estate attorney of his own, had begun asking a mutual family friend, a general practitioner named Dr. Alan Booth who golfed with Gary on Saturdays, vague, hypothetical questions about how these guardianship things usually get started, and had, according to Ashford Motor's own bank records that would surface much later, missed a $340,000 balloon payment to his primary inventory lender that same October, the exact month the Meridian offer arrived. I want to be honest about something. None of this, at the time, looked like anything to me. Land values go up. Families discuss selling property sometimes. I wasn't watching for a scheme in October of that year, because nobody hands you a reason to watch for one until the pattern's already halfway built. By November, according to what Desmond Reyes would later reconstruct from dealership records, Gary had quietly laid off 2 of his 4 sales staff and was personally covering a portion of the remaining payroll out of a personal line of credit, telling employees it was seasonal belt-tightening while telling his banker, in a recorded loan modification call Desmond would eventually obtain through discovery, that he had significant family assets that would resolve the shortfall within the next several months. Nobody in this family had authorized him to describe Ashford Ridge that way to anyone, least of all a lender. He simply already understood, by November, that he intended for it to become exactly that, an asset he controlled, whether or not it had ever actually been offered to him. My grandfather, on the other hand, was watching for exactly that, because he'd spent 34 years learning to recognize the shape of a person circling an asset before they'd worked up the nerve to reach for it directly. Your uncle asked me 3 separate times, over about a month, whether I'd thought about simplifying things at the lake house. My grandfather told me, much later, describing that fall with the same dry, precise recall he'd once used to summarize testimony from the bench. 3 times, in slightly different language each time. The way you ask a witness the same question different ways when you don't quite believe the first answer. I'd heard that particular rhythm from the other side of the bench for 3 decades. I recognized it immediately when it started coming from my own son. What my grandfather did next is the part of this story that took me the longest to fully understand, because it wasn't what I would have done, and it isn't, I think, what most people would have done. He didn't call a lawyer immediately and lock everything down. He didn't confront Gary directly. He sat with what he was seeing for several more weeks, and then, deliberately, he began to let a very specific, very carefully calibrated version of confusion into the way he behaved, but only, and this detail matters enormously, only in front of Gary. I wanted to see how far he'd actually go, he told me. Not because I doubted what I was seeing. Because I needed proof solid enough that nobody could later claim I was simply a bitter old man imagining his son's greed. The only way to get proof that clean is to let the greed show itself completely, on its own timeline, without me pushing it along. That winter, Gary started noticing, or believed he was noticing, small things. My grandfather repeating a question he'd just asked, word for word, 20 minutes after Gary had already answered it. Struggling, in front of Gary specifically, to remember which grandchild had which birthday, even reaching for my name once and landing on my mother's instead, correcting himself a beat too slowly to seem natural. Standing in his own kitchen for a long moment, in front of Gary specifically, seeming unsure where he'd put his car keys, patting his own pockets with a kind of soft, defeated confusion that Gary would later describe, almost verbatim, in his sworn petition. He timed it carefully, too, in a way none of us noticed until much later. He was never confused the moment Gary walked in. That would have looked staged even to someone who wanted to believe it. He'd let a visit run 15, 20 minutes of entirely normal conversation first, current events, a question about one of Gary's grandkids, before letting the first small lapse surface, almost incidentally, the way real fatigue actually creeps into a long conversation. It was, I understand now, a piece of genuine craft. The difference between a convincing performance and an obvious one is almost always in the pacing, and my grandfather had spent 3 decades watching witnesses learn that lesson the hard way in his courtroom. He performed none of it for me. Not once, that entire winter. Every Thursday I sat across that same kitchen table from a man who beat me at gin rummy with the same ruthless efficiency he always had, who could still recall, without hesitation, the exact statute number for a case he'd tried in 1994, who did the newspaper crossword in ink in under 15 minutes most evenings, and who once, in January, walked me through a fairly involved explanation of how he'd restructured his own investment accounts after Eleanor died to minimize estate tax exposure. A conversation so lucid and so specific that I would later hand the transcript of my own memory of it to Colleen Marsh nearly word for word. I had no reason, that whole winter, to think anything unusual was happening at all, which was, I would eventually understand, entirely the point. If you've ever had someone in your family quietly test the waters on something important without telling you what they were actually doing, tell me in the comments, because my grandfather was about to spend nearly a year doing exactly that, and I was the last person in this family to find out by March. Gary had started raising concerns about Dad openly at family dinners. Nothing dramatic yet, just small, seeded comments. He seemed a little foggy when I stopped by Tuesday. Did anyone else notice he asked me about the Henley account twice in one conversation? My mother, who has spent her entire adult life taking her brother's word for things rather than risk a confrontation she'd almost certainly lose, nodded along in the particular way she nods along with most of what Gary says. I remember one dinner in particular, the second Sunday of March, at my mother's house, where Gary spent nearly 20 minutes describing an incident from the week before. My grandfather supposedly calling him 3 times in one afternoon asking the same question about a dentist appointment that didn't exist. It's not like him at all, Mom, Gary said, shaking his head with an expression I would have called genuine concern if I hadn't, months later, watched him rehearse a nearly identical version of that same speech in front of Judge Ruiz. My mother reached over and squeezed his hand. Nobody at that table asked Gary for his own phone records, which would have shown, as Colleen's investigator later confirmed, exactly one call from my grandfather that entire week, lasting 4 minutes, about something else entirely. I want to say I caught it immediately. I didn't. I remember specifically dismissing an early comment from Gary in March with something close to irritation, telling him that 82-year-olds forget things sometimes and it didn't automatically mean anything was wrong. He'd looked at me, in front of the whole table, with an expression of wounded patience, the kind that makes you feel small for having pushed back at all, and said, I just think it's easier to deal with these things before they become a crisis, Nora. I'd think you of all people would understand that, given your job. I remember letting that comment sting more than it should have, and I remember not pushing further that night. I have thought about that conversation more times than I'd like to admit since, mostly because I understand now that my own dismissal, however reasonable it sounded at the time, was itself a small piece of exactly what my grandfather needed to see play out. who in this family would investigate, and who would simply accept whatever story got told loudest and most often, and who would fold the fastest under a well-placed guilt trip. By April, Gary had gotten Dr. Alan Booth to make a house call to Birchwood Lane, not a referral, not a formal cognitive workup, just a friendly, informal visit between golf buddies that somehow produced a short note in my grandfather's file describing some mild concerns regarding memory and orientation warranting further evaluation. I would later learn, through records Colleen Marsh subpoenaed, that this visit lasted 11 minutes, included no standardized cognitive testing of any kind, and that Dr. Booth had, 6 weeks earlier, refinanced a truck loan through a special arrangement Gary personally set up for him at Ashford Motors, a detail that would matter enormously later, though none of us understood its weight yet in April. In May, Gary began asking my mother to just come with him to a few visits at Birchwood Lane, visits where, my mother would later admit to me, my grandfather did seem noticeably more confused than she remembered him being, more hesitant with dates, more prone to trailing off mid-sentence. What none of us understood at the time was that my grandfather had, by May, refined his performance considerably, and had started calibrating it specifically to whoever he believed Gary had brought along as a witness. "I needed your mother to see something troubling enough that she wouldn't ask hard questions later," he told me, with a bluntness that still catches me off guard when I replay it. "I love your mother very much. I also know she has spent 40 years choosing the path of least resistance with her brother, and I needed to know, cleanly and on the record, whether that pattern would hold even here." It held. In June, Gary filed a petition in Larkin County Circuit Court requesting guardianship of the person and estate of Leonard Ashford, citing progressive cognitive decline consistent with early dementia and attaching Dr. Booth's 11-minute note as supporting documentation. The petition requested, among its specific enumerated powers, full authority to manage, encumber, or sell any real property held in Leonard Ashford's name. Language that, Colleen Marsh would point out to me later with a kind of grim admiration for how carefully it had been drafted, was broad enough to cover exactly one asset that mattered, Ashford Ridge. I found out about the petition the same way most of this family found out about most things that spring. Second-hand, 3 days after the fact, from my mother, over the phone, in a tone that suggested she'd already decided this was simply the responsible thing for Gary to be doing. "He's just trying to protect Dad's interests, Nora. You know how your uncle can be dramatic, but he wouldn't do this without real concern." I drove out to Birchwood Lane that same evening. The guardianship petition Gary had emailed the family sitting printed on my passenger seat, my hands not entirely steady on the wheel. If you've ever found out about something that directly affected someone you loved secondhand, days late, framed by somebody else's version of events, tell me in the comments. Because that drive out to Birchwood Lane was the moment I stopped trusting anyone's account of my grandfather's condition except my own. I sat down across from my grandfather that evening with the petition between us on the kitchen table, and I asked him, as plainly as I knew how, whether any of it was true. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, instead of answering directly, he asked me a question of his own. "What time of day does real cognitive decline from dementia typically get worse, Nora? In your professional experience?" It was such a strange, specific, almost clinical question to ask in the middle of what should have been an emotional conversation that it stopped me for a second. "Late afternoon into evening, usually," I told him. "It's called sundowning. Confusion, agitation, disorientation. It tends to peak as daylight fades, and it's fairly consistent once it starts, patient to patient. And if a man's confusion seemed to spike specifically around his son's visits, regardless of what time of day those visits happened to fall, morning, noon, or night, what would that tell you, professionally?" I sat with that question for what felt like a very long time. "It would tell me the pattern doesn't match the diagnosis," I said slowly. "Real sundowning tracks the clock. It doesn't track the visitor." He nodded, once, the same small, satisfied nod I imagine he gave a lawyer who'd finally asked the question he'd been waiting for the whole trial. "I want you to go back through every visit you've made to this house over the last 8 months, he said. "Every single Thursday. And I want you to tell me honestly whether the man you saw those evenings matches the man your uncle has been describing to a judge." I did exactly that, driving home that night, and for the next several days after. I pulled up the informal notes I'd started keeping years earlier out of professional habit, a running log I kept on my own phone of medications, appointments, and small observations for family members I checked in on, a habit any occupational therapist develops without necessarily planning to. 8 months of Thursday evenings. 8 months of gin rummy scores he'd won more often than lost. 8 months of crossword puzzles finished, largely without error, in under 15 minutes. 8 months of him recalling, unprompted, the names of my patients I'd mentioned to him only once, weeks earlier. Not one entry, across 8 months, showed anything resembling the man described in Gary's petition. I even found, buried in a note from late February, a detail I'd nearly forgotten entirely. He'd walked me through, unprompted and in careful sequence, the specific tax implications of a Roth conversion he was considering for a small portion of his retirement accounts, a conversation involving marginal rates, 5-year holding rules, and a comparison to what Eleanor's own IRA required after her passing. I remembered thinking, at the time, only that it was a slightly dull way to spend a Thursday evening. I didn't understand, until months later, that I'd been unknowingly documenting a man who was, by every clinical measure I knew how to apply, nowhere near the decline his own son was describing to a courtroom just a few months later. I sat with my laptop open at my kitchen table that night, scrolling back through months of notes I'd taken purely out of professional habit, feeling something shift in my understanding of the entire situation. Whatever was happening at Birchwood Lane, it wasn't what Gary's petition claimed. The only question left was what it actually was. I went back to Birchwood Lane 2 days later and did something I should have done from the very first conversation. I ran an actual, standardized assessment, the kind I run professionally dozens of times a year, rather than simply having dinner and calling it a check-in. I brought the physical mocha form with me, the same one taped inside a laminated folder I carry in my work bag, and I set it down on the kitchen table without ceremony. Humor me, I told him. Full assessment. Same as I'd run on any patient. He didn't argue. He sat up a little straighter, the way I imagine he once sat up a little straighter before taking the bench, and worked through it with a focus that had nothing performative about it at all, the trail-making task, the clock drawing, the 5-word delayed recall, the serial subtractions. I watched his pencil move across the naming section without a single hesitation, watched him draw a clock face with both hands positioned correctly on the first attempt, something a genuinely impaired patient very often struggles with even in early-stage decline. He scored a 29 out of 30, missing a single point on a delayed recall item that, statistically, plenty of cognitively healthy 82-year-olds miss on their first attempt under time pressure. A 29 is not a man in the early to moderate stages of dementia. A 29 is a man performing, for a specific and highly motivated audience, an idea of decline that he had clearly researched with some care. I sat there staring at the scoring sheet for a long moment, running the number against everything Gary had described at that dinner table in March, and none of it lined up. Not one piece. I've been reading, he admitted, when I showed him the score. Your grandmother had a friend, years ago, who went through this, the real version of it. I remembered enough of what that actually looked like to know what I needed to imitate, and enough of what your uncle would actually be watching for to know exactly when to let him see it. I sat there for a long moment, turning the scoring sheet over in my hands, feeling something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite anger settle into my chest all at once. You let me sit in this kitchen for 8 months thinking my own grandfather might be losing himself, I said. I looked up early intervention programs. Grandpa. I called a colleague about elder care attorneys in March, just to have a name ready, because I thought I might need one soon for entirely different reasons than the ones that turned out to be true. He didn't flinch from that. If anything, something in his expression softened, the courtroom precision easing just slightly. I know, he said. And I am sorry for the worry, genuinely, more than I think I fully understood I'd be causing until I watched your face just now. That was the cost I was least prepared to actually feel, once it started happening. I told myself it was necessary. I still believe it was. That doesn't mean it didn't cost you something real. I asked him, more sharply than I probably should have, why he hadn't simply told me from the beginning, why he'd let me spend 8 months worried and confused right alongside the rest of the family without a word of explanation. Because I needed to know something first, he said, and for the first time in that entire conversation, His voice lost its careful, courtroom precision and went, briefly, entirely soft. I needed to know whether you'd actually look, Nora, or whether you'd simply believe whatever you were told, the way your mother has her entire life, the way Derek's been trained to his whole life at that dealership. I couldn't tell you the plan up front. If I had, you wouldn't have needed to investigate anything. You'd have just known. And I needed, for reasons that are going to matter enormously in a few months, a record of you actually doing the looking yourself, on your own initiative, using your own professional judgment, completely independent of anything I told you. I sat in that kitchen a long time after he said that, understanding, finally, the shape of the entire year. I drove home that night with the windows down even though it was cold, needing the air more than the warmth, and I sat in my own driveway for a long time before I went inside. I kept turning over one specific detail he'd mentioned almost in passing, that he'd nearly slipped, more than once, into simply being himself in front of Gary, and had caught himself each time by imagining, deliberately, what his own father would have looked like in the early stages of the decline he'd actually watched up close decades earlier. He'd built the performance, in other words, out of grief he'd never fully processed the first time around, repurposed into something that could finally protect someone instead of just being endured. I didn't know what to do with that thought except sit with it, so I did, for a long while, before I finally went inside. If you've ever had someone you love test you without telling you, and then had to decide how you felt about that once you understood why, tell me in the comments, because I am still, honestly, working through exactly how I feel about it myself.